Our second panel, New Users Geometry, was organized and will be moderated by David Clark. David received his PhD from Emory University, where he says he had the good fortune to learn mathematics from the universal algebraists and to learn to teach mathematics from a lively group of Moore method people. I had the good fortune to be one of his fellow graduate students. His published work is focused on the interface between algebra and mathematical logic, topological dualities, neural networks, game theory, and evolutionary computation. He has held research positions in Canada, Germany, Switzerland, Portugal, and Australia. At the State University of New York, at New Paltz, he holds the rank of SUNY Distinguished Professor of Mathematics. He was formerly Associate Dean of Science and Engineering at SUNY New Paltz and is now chair of the mathematics department there. Most importantly, he is submissions editor of the Journal of Inquiry-Based Learning in Mathematics and the author of the forthcoming Euclidean Geometry, a Guided Inquiry Approach, about which I hope we will hear a lot more during this conference. David, the floor belongs to you and your panel.
Okay, well, I'd like to welcome you to the New Users panel. I have with me 4 panelists, and we're here to tell you about one course that the 5 of us have all taught. And so I would like to introduce each of the panelists and give them an opportunity to share their experiences with you. But before I do that, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about this one course. This course originated 7 years ago at the Legacy Conference here in Austin when Mr. Lucas commissioned a group of us to look into the possibility of designing a single IBL course that we could use we could support and promote and disseminate to try to advance the use of IBL in the teaching of mathematics. And the group of us met for several years to discuss it, and we identified 3 particular objectives that we wanted to try to meet in designing this course. We wanted to determine exactly what we wanted the course to be about, and so we agreed on 3 important objectives. The first was that we wanted a course that we could recommend as a first IBL teaching experience for instructors and a first IBL learning experience for students. Secondly, we wanted a course that could be that was taught in a wide range of venues, primarily undergraduate, but also high school and in-service teachers at the graduate level. And the third objective, particularly important, is we wanted to identify a place where there was a real market. In other words, there was a documentable lack of adequate materials to teach the course. And when we put these objectives together, an obvious candidate jumped out at us, and that was axiomatic geometry. Geometry has been taught for hundreds, thousands of years, and has became historically the prototype of an IBL course long before people talked about IBL. And it is taught in a range of venues from school mathematics, college, university mathematics. And the materials available to teach an axiomatic geometry course are primarily based on 2 paradigms. One is Euclid's system, Euclid's axioms, developed 2,000 years ago and taught extensively through the Western world. And the other is Hilbert's, developed at the end of the 19th century. And the difficulty with Euclid's system is that though it was used for so long, it is really out of date in terms of the content and the extensive development of mathematics leading up through the 19th century, which really impacted the way geometry could be understood and taught. And that was all resolved in the work of Hilbert, who put together his new geometry at the end of the 19th century, which resolved the problems of Euclid and created a modern system. And for mathematicians, this was a great advance, but the problem with Hilbert's system is that it is not practical to teach in most venues. It is abstract, and so it's designed more for professional mathematicians. And it's also, the axioms are very rudimentary, which means it's a very lengthy development to use it, so that if you use it, you don't get very far into geometry. And so our goal was to put together a course that would rectify these problems and take advantage of the need for this and create an IBL course. And so it turned out that I was asked to put this course together, and I just tell you briefly about it, and then we'll hear about some experiences of instructors who have used it. So a good way to just tell you briefly about it is to show you the table of contents. There's 8 chapters in the book, and if you look over these 8 chapters, you can see that they pretty much cover the content of school mathematics, high school mathematics, and we wanted to develop these a course that would develop these topics from axioms in a mathematically coherent way. Congruent figures, axioms and proofs, area, angles, similarity, trigonometry, circles, and perspective geometry, which includes solid geometry. And so we did this, and the course was first taught from a draft of this design in 4 years ago, and has been taught since. And the good news is that it's going to be published as a book that would be coming out very soon, and it's actually not easy to publish a book that's a strictly IBL text. If you look back at the table of contents and look at the page numbers, you can see that this is an IBL course. So it's not the typical volume that publishers look for, and it takes a bit of talking to get a publisher to publish something like this. It turned out that the book was used very successfully, but we had difficulty finding a publisher who would take interest in publishing it. And after having it turned down by 5 publishers, we finally found an enlightened editor, Tatiana Shubin here, who is the editor for the MSRI Math Circles Library Series. And so it will be published in that series by the AMS, and will be coming out probably in a matter of a few weeks from now. Unfortunately, couldn't be here quite in time for the conference, but in your course materials, there's a flyer about it, and you can get it at a generous conference discount. So what we're going to do is to hear about some experiences in teaching this course. And so I'd like to introduce our panelists. This is now not the ancient Euclidean geometry that we've taught, and not the rather old Hilbert geometry, but the new geometry. And so this is the new users panel who are teaching the new geometry. First, I'd like to introduce Keith Voss, who was part of the initial group in planning and designing this, and worked closely with me in the early drafts. Keith has a PhD in physics, but teaches mathematics at the Lawrenceville School in New Jersey. So, Keith, can you tell us about your experiences?
Sure. So I've taught the course now for 4 years. 2 different colleagues have worked with me, and we'll have our 3rd colleague working this new year. We teach the course. It's high school. It's a private boarding school just outside of Princeton, New Jersey. The students are primarily freshmen. The sections have about 12 students in it, so it's an optimal size for the discussions. There are some sophomores that might take the course, and they and the other students, they're selected for the course because they have shown that they don't have a need for additional Algebra 1 review. So for us, it's not that we treat the course as an honors course so much as we don't want to waste time reviewing Algebra 1 skills since we want to teach an axiomatic geometry course. As far as how far we've gone, we don't have the chapters up there again, but we teach all of the chapters except the last 2. The final chapter is actually new this year, so we didn't have a chance to adjust our schedule to make it that far. But my colleague this past year did teach the circle geometry at the very end. And what I've done with my class is based on their preference, based on their reflection on the material. After we finished similarity and I guess it was similarity and dilations, they actually started asking really interesting questions about questions that weren't in the text. So is it possible to dilate a circle from a point that's not its center? If you do you still get a circle? And these are freshmen coming up with these questions, and it's really exciting to hear that. And again, because we don't have required time points and standards that we must meet on a schedule, I just said, great, we're going to drop the last chapter and answer the questions you have. So every time they asked a question like that, I just kept track of them, and that became the next. The strong students are much stronger than they would have been in our regular geometry class, and the mid-range students are where they would have been in a regular geometry class. Now, granted, mid-range for us is very strong for most of the public schools in the area. So we do have a very strong clientele.
Let's see, next I'd like to introduce Gary Richter, who's been teaching since the beginning this course at Southwestern University. And Gary is our most experienced IBL and Moore method instructor. And he's developed, using this course, pioneered the development of it as a general education course for liberal arts students, using the initial part of the book. So, Gary, can you tell us about that?
Thank you. I'd like to respond to something that Keith brought up, which is the resistance of students who have been taught by the usual methods to suddenly finding themselves with the responsibility of doing these things on their own. There's an old saying about if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach a man how to catch fish, then he eats for a lifetime. Well, that's sort of what we're about. We want to teach our students to catch their own fish. And if you tell the story that way, it sounds like a great thing. Eats for a lifetime. But what nobody ever says about that story is, how do you think it feels to be the person who has been receiving a free fish every day, and then suddenly you say, no more, you have to go out and catch your own? You're going to get some resistance. I teach at Southwestern University, which is a 4-year undergraduate liberal arts college located about 30 miles north of here. Since the summer of 2008, I have been using Dr. Clark's geometry notes in 2 courses. One is the general education course that Dr. Clark mentioned, and the other, once I used these notes in a course for junior and senior level math majors. So those audiences are very different. The more elementary course at my university is called Mathematical Concepts, which doesn't limit it very much, since that's what we teach in all of our math courses. The course might just as well be entitled Math Appreciation, or Math for Liberal Arts, or Math for students who are required to take a math course but have never been very good at math and hence fear and hate it, and really, really, really hope to get credit for the course without actually having to learn any math. A reasonable question for me would be, Dr. Richter, these notes were intended as an introduction to geometry at the high school level, presumably for 9th and 10th graders. So how do you justify teaching these notes in a university setting for students who have already had credit for high school geometry, and presumably this would be a waste of time? So there are a number of answers to that. One is, although the students that I have taught have indeed had high school geometry, they don't remember very much of it. So let's look at it again. It's also the case that none of these students has experienced geometry as an axiomatic development, axioms and theorems. And building on that, none of these students has been in a course which asks them to prove the theorems on their own. So this is a worthwhile thing for my students to be doing, even the math majors. I found the semester that I taught the geometry course to the juniors and seniors who were math majors, and also at the same time taught it for the more elementary students. The math majors moved through the material a little bit faster than the non-math majors, but the main difference was that the math majors made more elaborate and creative mistakes than the non-math majors. It was also my hope that with the math concepts class that I would take a course that had typically been taught as a collection of miscellaneous and unconnected, interesting, cute facts about mathematics chosen for their entertainment value, and replace that with a course which was coherent. And my hope was that if we focused on one topic and we went slowly enough and carefully enough, and the students did the work, that by the end of the semester, some of the students at least would, for the first time in their lives, have the satisfaction of feeling that they actually understood and could do a part of mathematics. There are many things I could say about this. I want to touch on one particular piece of it. David Clark, early in the notes, has students making constructions with a straight edge and compass, which is terrific because it gives these students empirical experience with how these things work on a sheet of paper. Problems are given such as bisect a given angle. First, the students are expected to figure out how to do it. And second, the students are expected to write up a list of instructions so that somebody else could follow those instructions and duplicate the bisection of the angle. This turns out to be an extremely difficult exercise. To write a sequence of English sentences which are correct and coherent and in an understandable order is very difficult. I always have to remind many of my students that a declarative sentence or an imperative sentence ends with a period. And typically the first word in the sentence begins with an uppercase letter. I learned that in the first grade, and I suspect my students did too, but somehow in a math course, that doesn't matter anymore. I have fairly high standards for writing and speaking. One semester, I had a student who was quite good in the course. She took the course seriously, came to class, worked problems, went to the board, and mostly wrote things that were correct. But I noticed that she did something that many of my students do, and that is, given a theorem, rather than look at a previous theorem as a bridge, as a help to the current theorem, they want to go back to the axioms and the first definitions, which is where they feel comfortable, and they want to make a proof from scratch. So I suggested to her on a number of occasions, well, why don't you look at this theorem and see if you can use this theorem? So she was reluctant to do it, and one day she stayed after class to explain to me how uncomfortable she felt being pushed to use this theorem that seemed less solid to her than the foundations. And she used a surprising word. She said, I feel uncomfortable wielding the earlier theorem to prove the more recent one. Well, I thought this is an interesting use of the word wield. And I commented to her, I said, well, you know, this is an unusual use of that word. I jokingly said, you must be a writer. She said, I am, which meant that she takes her writing seriously and looks for a career in writing. So I noted that. I thought that was interesting. But then at the end of the semester, she came to me and she said, Dr. Richter, I really want to thank you for this course because your standards for writing in here have improved my writing in all the other areas where I write. And I could not have been happier to hear that kind of comment. And these Moore-style courses can also have that effect on our students.
Most of the use of this text has been in teaching undergraduate math majors, and our last two panelists can tell you about that. So next I'd like to introduce Todd Grunmeyer, who teaches at Cal Polytech, and he's a more recent member of our group. He's taught this course twice, and when Todd was first interested in teaching it, he wrote to me and asked me if he could have a copy of the notes, and I sent them to him and said, if you have any questions, get in touch with me and I can help you. And I didn't hear anything for a while, like a couple weeks, and then he wrote to me and said, well, I've worked through the first 5 chapters and it all looks fine, but I have a question about theorem 107, I think it was, and yeah, there was a mistake in theorem 107, but we got it fixed. So I'd like Todd to tell you about his experience in teaching this.
So as David said, I've had the opportunity to teach the class twice now. It's a junior, senior level class for math majors, typically taken by our students in the teaching concentration, so who are studying to be secondary teachers, but I get a mix of math majors in there as well. It's the first in a 2-quarter sequence. The first class is titled Euclidean Geometry, which is where I've used the notes. The second is titled Modern Geometries. The prerequisite for the class is our Methods of Proof course. The course is offered over 10 weeks, meets twice a week for an hour and 50 minutes. The first time through I had 15 students, which was perfect, and definitely good for my first attempt. The second time through I had 25 students. Somewhat surprisingly to me, we made it about the same distance in the course notes both times. We made it somewhere about halfway through chapter 5 in the 10 weeks. I'll tell you a little bit about how I set up the course and what my expectations were for the students. So both times through, I put students in groups. I looked a little bit at their past history, how they did in our proof course, and how they'd done in some other undergraduate course. I created groups of 3 students. My expectation was that they would develop proofs within their groups and be prepared as a group to present their proofs. So all of the proofs and solutions were presented by the students. So they were asked to work in groups, but yet present things individually, but their group would be assigned whatever score was given on that presentation. So there was a little bit of responsibility for making sure everyone in the group was up to speed and ready to present a problem if your group was going to suggest that you could present it. Class was typically a little bit of time for them to work. I would come into class, I'd put, say, 3 or 4 problem numbers on the board. I'd say, if your group's ready to present that problem, put your name down. Under that problem, you have 20 minutes to decide if you're ready to present, and then I'm going to choose which groups present. We'll see how much time is left, and we'll make a plan from there. Groups were chosen to present based on whoever had been the longest since they'd given a presentation. And then I expected every student individually to keep a portfolio of every problem that we proved or attempted to prove in class. and the presentations and portfolios made up about 25% of their grade. The other 75% was homework, exams, and a final exam. So some things that stuck out for me as I went through this twice, a few things related to teaching, a few things related to students' content knowledge that was a little bit surprising to me. As was suggested over here, I really thought putting them in groups would help break the mold of me as the authority in the classroom, but I realized that at this level, they've had so much experience sitting in a classroom, listening to lecture, and viewing someone else as the authority that I couldn't break that in 10 weeks. I think I made progress. I answered almost every question for the 10 weeks with a question. And I think they started to realize that maybe I wasn't the right person to ask the question if they wanted a direct answer. And they started relying on asking their group mates a little bit more questions that I was surprised they might actually ask me to begin with. And that was the case in both classes. I was actually really surprised by their willingness to question and critique each other. So I spent a lot of time in the first day kind of setting my expectations and telling them how I wanted them to view their peers while they were up there, and asking them to, to be respectful, but to be willing to give some critique and ask questions. And they really settled into that role and were really good at asking each other questions and then running with the conversation themselves as a group based on the questions that they asked. And this often led to discussing multiple ways to prove things, which was great. I could sit back on a number of occasions and just let them discuss, and someone would say, oh, but I tried to do it this way, is that okay? And then I would say, what do you think, is that okay? And then amongst themselves, they would decide that was a legitimate way to attack the proof as well. I was really naive the first time. Stan Yoshinobu introduced the materials to me and to David, and I worked through them, as he said, and I thought, oh, Stan, I think I'm going to need something else. Like, we're going to get through this really quickly, so I think I better be prepared to have other material. So the content coverage was a lot slower than I expected, but that didn't deter me at all from a second time around. I really felt like the understanding, the trade-off in understanding was well worth it. And I learned that if I listened carefully and took notes, it was much, much easier for me to understand student misconceptions. They came very clearly, and it made it easier for me to ask questions in class that I thought would address those misconceptions. A couple things about their content knowledge that actually surprised me that I learned. As was said before, there's some compass and straight edge constructions to start. I actually used Geometer Sketchpad for them to do those constructions, but only let them use the line segment and circle tools in Sketchpad. But my students had a really hard time transitioning from constructions to formal language to justify their constructions. So they could determine how to bisect an angle, but actually writing a formal justification of that and determining what language to use to do that was exceptionally difficult in both classes. It took a day or two to get over that hurdle and some discussions in both cases, but I was a little bit surprised there. The other thing that was a difficulty in both classes was their ability to understand what to assume when trying to prove something. So they would often, for example, if they wanted to prove that the base angles of an isosceles triangle were congruent, they would think they needed to start from scratch, construct the isosceles triangle, justify that it's isosceles, and then from there prove that the base angles were congruent, instead of just saying, let ABC be an isosceles triangle, and go about the process of proving that the base angles were congruent. And that permeated the entire quarter, to the point where, as I'd never done before, I would ask questions on exams like, what do you assume if you want to prove this statement? What do you then need to show? Okay, now go ahead and actually complete this proof. And on a couple occasions, using the technology led to trying to justify things with pictures. So there were a couple things, okay, this is true because basically the technology tells me it's true instead of actually formally justifying it. So we're asked to say a little bit about the students' experiences. Just a couple things. One, I got continually positive feedback in both courses. I don't know if these numbers mean very much, but we do course evaluations every quarter. The first time through, the evaluations were 4 out of 4, and the second time 3.7 out of 4. So students seem to be pretty happy. And I'll finish with one quote from a student evaluation that I think sums things up reasonably well. A student wrote, "I love this class. I got so much out of it academically and pedagogically. I want to teach high school math. He lets you struggle and become creatively frustrated before leading you to an answer. This gives much more meaning, excitement, understanding, and passion for the problem on the part of the student.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Our last panelist is Judith Covington, who teaches at LSU Shreveport, and she's our most recent recruit to the group. Judith took on teaching geometry just a couple of years ago. I mentioned earlier the Hilbert geometry that has been available and many of us have used for a long time. I taught a Hilbert geometry course for many years and developed a set of notes that we have on the journal now based on Hilbert's axioms. And when Judith started, she was teaching geometry not only new to IBL, but new to geometry, and learning it both IBL and geometry the first time together, which was a serious undertaking. But she did a tremendous job. She taught that a couple of times and now has taught the new geometry, so she has the unique perspective of having taught both. And so she's going to tell us about that now.
So as he said, I teach at LSU Shreveport. I've taught our geometry course using IBL for 3 semesters. We typically offer this course in the spring. So it was spring 2010, 2011, and this past spring 2012. Our geometry course is a 400 level course. It is required only of the math education majors, but math majors can take it as an elective. And we are a small school, 4,200 students, and we have very few math majors and sometimes just a few more than that math ed majors. In the spring 2010 and 2011, as he said, I used his first set of notes, which he refers to as the Hilbert notes. And this is where you'll see I really am at a small school. The first semester I had 3 students. And because the math education students have to have this to graduate, we do have to run it once a year for them. So that's why it got to run with just 3 students. The next semester, I had 4 students. Only one of them really wasn't that great, so it was like I had 3 students. And that was an interesting activity because when I was trying to select books each time, do I go with the more strenuous notes? Do I go with the other notes that at the first glance did look a little bit easier to me? And I looked at the fact that in both of those situations, I had about half math majors and half math education majors. So I wanted to try and address needs of both of them. This past semester, I really don't know what happened. I had 10 students. I guess maybe we recruited some more math education majors. Most of them were math education majors. I had the 10 students, and at that point I decided maybe for this group of students the Euclidean notes would be a little bit better. So I made the decision to change those. I found both sets of notes easy to teach from, and I can't say enough about how supportive David was. And if you're ever thinking of teaching from either set of notes, usually if you send him an email, you know, he's a night person, so you might not get a message till the next morning, but he's always going to answer very quickly. I found the first set of notes very detail-oriented. If you wanted to prove that 2 lines were going to intersect, you had to actually prove that. Whereas in the newer set of Euclidean notes, the students were given a little bit of more guidance to just talk about where they would intersect. A couple of weird things that happened this past semester, because one of my students was student teaching, this course had to be in the evening. So we met once a week from 5 to 8. And if you've ever taught a night class, you know that the student's approach is if they have to come to class once a week, they only need to do homework once a week. And you also know that for IBL, they need a little bit more time to think about that. So we all had a challenge on working with that. So we did start with that. I had 2 students drop the course over the semester. One of them dropped fairly early. I think maybe didn't like having to go to the board and explain everything. And the other student ended up dropping about midterm and even was having some issues in some of her other math classes, beginning to see that maybe she didn't have the strong background that she needed. So I had, and I also had one student that was in a car accident accident that had to take an incomplete. So I had 7 students that completed the course. Some of them obviously did better than others. As far as material that we covered, looking back now, I know I let them drag things out a little too much at the beginning because they were new to going to the board, and I think they kind of caught on. Well, if we can get her distracted, then there's fewer of us that can present. And I again was adjusting to this 2.5 to 3 hour class period every evening. So there were some things I think I would do different in the future that would let me get through that first set of material a little more quickly. But we did get through chapter 4. I was really determined that we could at least get through some of the angle measure, the linear measure, wanted to get through with that. Our course is, our students are required to take our Intro to Proof course before this. But in my opinion, our Intro to Proof instructor doesn't make that a strong enough course. I mean, one of the first things they start with is truth tables, which really should have been covered in discrete math. And so they should, to me, they should start more. So they still have a little bit of weakness in writing proofs. Some of what Todd said about not knowing what to assume. One problem that they had after we did the compass and straight edge constructions, then we had proofs where we proved these things existed. Well, then later when they should have been using something we already proved, they wanted to go back and tell me, not this angle has an angle bisector, but they wanted to go through the steps again of how you would find the angle bisector, and that took a little bit of working. Some of the students, they're just not used to having to come talk with the teacher. They're used to the homework being just like what they've seen before, and that was a learning experience to me. I had one student that told me all the time, I've never worked this hard in a math class before. And like she thought that was a bad thing. Yeah, I think she still said it at the end of the semester, I've never had to work this hard before. And I asked her, I said, and doesn't it feel good? Doesn't it feel good that you've done this and you've succeeded? So this is an experience. While I always have to go through the struggle every semester because it's always a new group of students doing it. No one else at my university really teaches IBL, so I have to go through that, but it's worth all the work. I do think I'm crazy, or maybe I don't have the grading scheme down the best yet, because I actually had the students turn in every problem and graded every problem. They didn't do it that way, but I think at the beginning, again, for my students, when I had 3 students in a class, it really wasn't that bad. If I'm going to start having 10, then maybe I have to reevaluate that. But I think it's a really strong, the students do learn more. They have to take more ownership in what they're doing, and I think that says a lot about when Patrick was giving his talk earlier, what do we want to take with them out of that? I think having them do at IBL is worth everything. And if you have any questions during the week, I'll be around.
Okay, thank you, Judith. Let's see, we also, I and a couple of my colleagues have taught it at SUNY New Paltz, primarily to mathematics and math secondary ed teachers, and had similar experiences to what you've heard. We've had another number of retirements at New Paltz, and have some openings there for assistant professors. So if you know anybody who's interested in a position and interested in IBL, tell them to get in touch with me. I think one of the things that you hear from these testimonies, focusing on this one course and students' experiences, is how much students have to learn that they don't know, that if you're not teaching by IBL, you would assume they know. Just many things that they work out by doing it through an IBL experience, that if you're lecturing, you would have just sort of brushed over those things. And I think that really points to the value of IBL. So I'm really grateful to the panelists and many others who have taken what I wrote and brought it to life. And I'd like to open the floor for questions and comments. There's many others who've taught from it whose perspective would be interesting to hear, and you can direct questions to the group of us or to any one of us. Yes?
I'm going to be teaching in the I'm going to be teaching in the Georgia Governor's Honors Program in a week or so. How appropriate do you think this would work for high school gifted students who are extremely good at mathematics? Would this be appropriate for them?
Well, I think you'll find that they really do, they eat it up. Once they get, I'd say, maybe midway through chapter 2, where they've gotten the first proof, they've worked some things with, they've been told that what it takes to show that two angles aren't congruent to each other as an axiom. Once they get that piece in place, and they do their first indirect proof, they really start looking at problems differently than they have in the past. They start investing their time very significantly. When we did it, we had a year, and I assigned one theorem a night for them to work on. You obviously want to do it a little more rapidly than that, and you probably want to look ahead and see how to group them so that they could learn from any one night. The three problems wouldn't necessarily be dependent upon each other. But I think a 4-week program where you actually had, say, 4 hours of 3 or 4 hours of work each night, that would make some serious progress.
Yeah, I would recommend it, and I'm available for anyone who wants to teach it. So just I'll work with you.
My question is going to sound like it comes from an old fogey, which it is, and that is, what consideration was given to using Dr. Moore's geometry class, and how does this differ from Dr. Moore's class?
Yes, Dr. Moore's class was closely related to Hilbert's and is quite similar. He developed it right after Hilbert did, and he had his own approach, but it's very close to that. And so it takes a lot longer to get very far with it. So you don't cover these topics, which was one of our primary goals, to cover these basic topics. So that's really the difference.
What is the largest class size with which you could recommend trying this?
Well, we've talked about a range here. Like any IBL class, it certainly works much better if the class isn't too large. My experience is I teach classes generally from 15 to 25. I've taught them as big as 30. Gets sort of difficult if it gets bigger than that. If it gets too small, then it's sometimes hard to, you don't have somebody to present something all the time, so you don't want it too small. But as you've seen, it's possible in quite a wide range.
But so to be concrete, if I have to teach this class and I don't have a choice, it's going to be 40, 50, 60 students, then do you recommend that I don't try this?
I guess I haven't tried that.
Right.
Yes, sure.
So I noticed some of these classes are specifically for future high school teachers. I know that the Common Core standards for geometry now involve a lot more things involving transformations. I was wondering if you've thought at all about, I didn't see transformations in your list of contents. Have you thought about having more material with those?
Okay, yes, let's see, we don't have, maybe we can get the list up there. We definitely do have transformations in there. Congruence is defined transformationally in terms of isometries, and then similarity is defined in terms of transformations with dilations. And then perspective geometry, you look at the transformation from three-dimensional space into a window, which is a different kind of transformation. So it definitely is done transformationally. Okay. Okay, thank you very much.